I'm now going to look at the section of the paper that talks about implementing the Structural Adjustment Program, tactics utilized by the Nigerian government. This is in the 1980s and the 1990s. And as I said in the previous video, it draws upon my PhD research done in the 80s. So the process of the implementation of the IMF conditionalities can be traced through the methods deployed by the three successive administrations which were involved in the 1980s up until 1993. These were the civilian administration of Alhaji Shehu Shagari, which lasted from September 1979 to December 1983, and the military regimes of General Muhammadu Buhari that lasted from December 1983 to August 1985, and General Ibrahim Babangida, which was from August 1985 to August 1993. There was a significant difference in the approach that both the Shagari and Buhari, while attempting to incorporate the IMF framework in their economic policies, refrained from implementing the crucial conditionalities, namely devaluation, subsidy removal, trade liberalization, and privatization. On the other hand, the Babangida administration made the implementation of these conditionalities its raison d'etre. A comparison of their respective attitudes to conditionalities such as trade liberalization and privatization, for example, illustrates this observation. So I'm going to do a comparison of the state attitude towards the problematic conditionalities. The first I'll look at is trade liberalization. Though through the Economic Stabilization Act of 1982, which accepted the principle that economic recovery should be promoted through austerity programs, the Shagari administration put restrictions on imports. It recalled all unused import licenses for review and required compulsory advance deposit of 50 to 250% on various imports. The Buhari regime extended these policies, placing all imports under license in the belief that import controls, together with aggressive local sourcing of raw materials, were vital to the recovery of the manufacturing sector. Thus, in 1984, only 20 items were exempted from payments of import duties, and industries were allowed to import only essential raw materials and spare parts. The Babangida regime proclaimed its faith in the efficacy of the free market and phased out import licensing. In October 1985, the Minister of Finance dismissed manufacturers' fears that foreign goods would be dumped on the Nigerian market with the explanation that tariffs would be adequate protection for locally manufactured goods. He also expected domestic productivity to be enhanced by devaluation. which would make imports more expensive and force people to produce and buy locally. It was also government policy to give incentives, such as the credit and capital that domestic producers require to improve their production profile. In September 1986, duties on all finished and manufactured goods were reduced. The 1987 budget reduced the number of formally banned goods and those requiring licenses. There was also a downward adjustment on import tariffs, a reduction on advance payment of import duty to 25% until full receipt of the goods, the abolition of import duties on raw materials and components for manufactured goods that were slated for export, and various incentives directed at attracting foreign investment. Now for privatization. In 1981, before the Shagari administration approached the IMF for balance of payments support, it appointed a presidential commission to review 34 major parastatals and recommend necessary reforms. In its report of October 1981, the commission recommended increased participation by the private sector in non-strategic parastatals and the injection of financial discipline and managerial accountability in these parastatals. However, the administration's efforts were limited to an announcement that it would forego its ownership in some parastatals to private interests in principle. Nothing more concrete was done before the Buhari coup. On its part, the Buhari regime appointed the Al-Hakim Study Group on Statutory Corporations to deliberate on the issue of privatization and suggest suitable policy options. The study group recommended the privatization of some enterprises and the commercialization of others. The regime itself decided to commercialize rather than privatize. The Babangida regime, on the other hand, repeatedly expressed its commitment to privatization and commercialization. It set up the Technical Committee on Privatization and Commercialization, that is TCPC, to facilitate the achievement of this goal. It also created the Industrial Development Coordination Committee, IDCC, to expedite the application process for foreign investors. Towards this end, amendments were made to the Nigerian Enterprises Promotion Decree, or NEPD, of 1972 and its 1977 amendment. Thus, by 1989, foreigners were allowed to own 100% of manufacturing companies instead of 40%, as formerly permitted by the NEPD, or the Nigerian Enterprises Promotion Decree. They were also allowed to invest in areas previously reserved for indigents, including small-scale manufacturing and the commercial and service sectors. In his 1986 budget speech, the Minister of Finance, Kalu Idika Kalu, announced a policy of, quote, gradual and deliberate, unquote, divestment of government holdings in all non-strategic industries. Government subsidies to parastatals were reduced by 50%, while the dissolution and privatization of 7 agro-allied parastatals, which had been initiated by Buhari, was completed. Commodity boards, which had overseen the production and distribution of agricultural produce and other commodities, were abolished, along with the Nigerian National Supply Company, which had procured and distributed consumer goods. State governments were given more responsibility for implementing agricultural policy, while the number of river basin and rural development authorities, which had been doubled by Buhari, were reduced from 18 back to 9. The divestment of government interests in holdings, such as hotels and brewing companies, began in 1987, with its shares being sold through a private issuing house based in Lagos. On July 5th, Decree number 27 on privatization and commercialization was promulgated. Now I turn to contesting views, a phenomenon that I characterized as a bourgeoisie divided. Before and since the inception of SAP, a multiplicity of contesting social forces and economic classes have continually expressed vociferous opinions about it. Since the private sector was deemed to be a primary beneficiary from the downsizing of the state and fostering a spirit of entrepreneurship, it is significant that it was also the source of some of the most widely differing views. Many leaders of economic thought subscribed to monetarist ideas, which present the market system as the most rational means of resource allocation. However, being heavily import dependent, the bulk of the private sector, particularly the manufacturing businesses, ended up being negatively affected by SAP. This led to an intra-class debate, which is reflective of a split between the comprador bourgeoisie, who aligned themselves with foreign capital interests, and the nationalist bourgeoisie, which attempted to create a domestic base that would enable them to compete effectively against foreign capital. Initially, some manufacturers applauded the SAP measures. This included members of the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, or MAN, the Nigerian Association of Chambers of Commerce, Industries, Mines, and Agriculture, NASIMA, directors of the Nigerian Stock Exchange, and chief executives of major banks. In general, they agreed that a mechanism that was a mechanism through which multiple problems could be solved. They felt that pervasive government interference with the free operation of the market and the concomitant drain on government resources could be put to an end, along with inefficiency, low productivity, unprofitability, unemployment, and corruption. Some indeed called for the repeal of the NEPD on the grounds that the laws designed to promote indigenization were hostile to foreign investors and damaging to the Nigerian economy. The opposing views came from members of the Nigerian Association of Small Industries. They feared that privatization would jeopardize easy and affordable access to raw materials, and that only speculators and large industries could thrive. Similarly, some elements within the state apparatus, such as the Senior Staff Association of Statutory Corporations and Government-Owned Companies, found no merit in the argument that the private sector was more efficient than public enterprises. They pointed out that the private sector was itself sustained by heavy government subsidies. With regard to the petroleum subsidy, the overriding concern of the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria was that the removal had the potential to cause an inflationary spiral, retard the recovery of the agricultural sector, and accelerate the collapse of public transportation. It also considered that subsidy removal would prove dangerous when combined with strict wage controls and deregulation of prices. Chief executives in the insurance industry stressed the advantages of a subsidy, which kept local production costs and inflation rates low. Many manufacturers also considered that trade liberalization would make them vulnerable to unfair competition from cheaper imports of finished goods. And they characterized the September 1986 interim tariff structure as traders' tariffs that encouraged the dumping of consumer goods on Nigeria. Indeed, Decree number 32 of December 15, 1986 confirmed their fears as it rendered local manufacturers and assembly plants defenseless against imports. The devaluation of the Naira caused considerable erosion in the living standards of the majority of Nigerians. Workers were hit by underemployment, unemployment, and mass retrenchment. Wages were grossly insufficient to meet basic needs, and people embarked on a multitude of survival strategies. The informal sector bloomed. However, the initial blossoming of this sector became increasingly less profitable because of the sheer numbers of people involved, and they were mostly competing against one another for customers and resources. The drastic reduction in consumer purchasing power meant that manufacturers were burdened by huge inventories of unsold goods. This was compounded by the fact that they were already operating at reduced capacity of an average 20 to 25%. The devaluation of the Naira neither generated the expected increase in foreign investment nor a stable exchange rate. Instead, for manufacturers, devaluation and the reduction of the petroleum subsidy reduced their production and customer base. Capital market speculation became prevalent. Small-scale industries were particularly affected by an increasing wave of mergers, closures, and collapse. The Manufacturers Association of Nigeria attributed these difficulties to the shortage of foreign exchange, high interest rates, and chronic depreciation of the Naira. Even though the finance sector was one of the primary beneficiaries of SAP, The sector's profits were sharply curtailed by the low value of the naira, vis-a-vis what was called and still remains called hard currencies, like the dollar and pound sterling, and today the euro. In 1989, some foreign banks either reduced their commitments in Nigeria or they pulled out altogether due to the reduced profitability of their operations. The naira cost of imported inputs continued to rise astronomically, while that of locally made imports also increased drastically, with the slide of the naira in the foreign exchange just going on and on. The deregulation of interest rates made the cost of borrowing higher than many manufacturers could afford. The regime of liquidity and credit squeeze also worsened the cash flow problems of manufacturers. With all these developments, opposition to SAP steadily mounted within the manufacturing class. The next section will look at the struggle to remove the petroleum subsidy, a struggle that we still have with us today. But I'm going to stop here, and then, part 3 would look at the petroleum subsidy removal struggle and other matters. All right, bye-bye.